All right, let's go. Number 10. The Kingdom of Aksum. The highlands of northern Ethiopia are not a place most people associate with the word empire. The terrain is dry, rocky, terraced by centuries of subsistence farming. The villages are small, the roads are unpaved. Nothing about the landscape suggests that one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world once operated from this exact ground. But in a field just outside the modern town of Aksum, standing among goats and low stone walls, there is a granite obelisk carved from a single block that rises nearly 80 feet into the air. It has false doors and false windows etched into its surface, as though the stone itself is pretending to be a building. It has been standing there since the 4th century, and for most of the last 500 years, the civilization that built it was simply left out of history. The obelisk is not alone. There are dozens of them in the field, some toppled, some broken, some still standing. The largest one that still stands, known as the Obelisk of Aksum, weighs approximately 160 tons. For comparison, the heaviest stone at Stonehenge weighs roughly 25 tons. That is not a marginal difference. That is a different category of engineering entirely. The stelae were carved from single blocks of granite, with false architectural features, multi-story facades with detailed window frames and door panels, rendered in stone with a precision that suggests the carvers were replicating real buildings that no longer exist. Gold coinage minted with Ge'ez inscriptions circulated across the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. The metal was not debased. The lettering was not crude. These were coins designed to function in international commerce alongside Roman and Persian currency. No surviving Aksumite text describes how the stelae were quarried, transported, or erected. The nearest quarry capable of producing blocks of that size is approximately 4 kilometers from the stelae field. No tool marks on the quarry face indicate a known cutting technique. No ancient engineering manual from anywhere in the region explains how 160 tons of shaped granite was moved 4 kilometers over uneven terrain and then raised vertically. The ramp theories proposed for Egyptian obelisks do not transfer cleanly because the Aksumite stelae are taller relative to their base width, making them less stable during the raising process. The method remains an open problem. Every proposed solution introduces a new engineering question that has no answer. The reach of the civilization that produced these objects extended far beyond the highlands. Aksum controlled trade routes stretching from the Nile Valley to the Red Sea to the western coast of India. Ships carrying ivory, gold, frankincense, and emeralds departed from the port of Adulis and returned with silk, spices, and iron from Persia, India, Sri Lanka, and the Byzantine Empire. Aksum was minting gold coins while most of post-Roman Europe had reverted to barter. It was not a peripheral kingdom at the edge of someone else's trade network. It was a hub. The Persian prophet Mani, writing in the 3rd century, listed the 4 great empires of the world: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. Not a secondary power, not a regional curiosity. A peer state to Rome, recognized as such by an outside observer with no political reason to flatter. The civilization that carved 160-ton obelisks and minted gold for international markets was placed, by a contemporary witness, in the same category as Rome, and then it was removed from the curriculum. Aksum did not fall to a single catastrophic invasion. It contracted over centuries as trade routes shifted and the climate dried. Later Ethiopian kingdoms built over its foundations, and its name faded from the records that European scholars chose to read. The erasure was completed not by war but by indifference. European historiography treated sub-Saharan Africa as a continent without monumental civilizations, and Aksum, standing in plain sight, was simply not seen. In 1991, Stuart Munro Hay of the University of Cambridge published a comprehensive survey of Aksumite material culture. His findings confirmed that the empire's trade network rivaled Rome's in geographic reach during the 3rd and 4th centuries. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Aksum was not obscure in its own time. Mani named it alongside Rome. Byzantine ambassadors visited its court. Its coins circulated across the Indian Ocean. This was not a civilization that slipped through the cracks of history. This was a civilization that was recognized, documented, and then excluded from the version of history that most of the world was taught. The stelae are still standing. The coinage is still legible. The trade records still exist. The civilization was not lost to time. It was lost to curriculum. The question is not how Aksum fell. The question is who decided it was not worth remembering. Before we continue to the next item, here's a little something for you. If you're the type of person who wants to keep learning but doesn't always have time to sit down and watch, we put all of our stuff on Spotify. That way your drive becomes a history lesson. Your evening walk becomes a trip through the dark ages. Even falling asleep becomes something worthwhile. And the best thing is that you can listen without any ads or interruptions. The link is right there in the comments section, and honestly, it might change how you spend your downtime. All right, let's keep going with the next item. Number 9. The Fatimid Caliphate. In the year 1011, a mathematician named Ibn al-Haytham arrived in Cairo at the invitation of the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim. He had been summoned to solve a practical problem. The annual flooding of the Nile was devastating agricultural land, and al-Haytham had proposed an engineering solution, a system of dams and channels that would regulate the river's flow. He traveled south along the Nile, surveyed the terrain, studied the volume and force of the seasonal floods, and reached a conclusion that would nearly cost him his life. The project was impossible. The river was too powerful, the terrain too vast, and the engineering required was centuries beyond anything available. What al-Hakim did with that answer would change the course of science, though not in the way anyone intended. Al-Haytham understood that telling a caliph known for executing advisors that his flagship project was unfeasible was not a survivable conversation. He feigned madness. Al-Hakim placed him under house arrest rather than ordering his death, and for the next decade, confined to a room in Cairo, Al-Haytham conducted the experiments that would produce the Book of Optics. He darkened the room. He allowed light to enter through a small aperture. He observed the inverted image projected on the opposite wall and methodically proved that vision does not work by the eye emitting rays outward, as Euclid and Ptolemy had taught for over 1,000 years. Light enters the eye. It does not leave it. The method he used to prove this, controlled observation, repeatable experiment, mathematical verification, systematic elimination of variables, would later be called the scientific method. It was formalized in a room in Cairo 5 centuries before Francis Bacon would be credited with its invention. The infrastructure that supported this kind of work was not accidental. Al-Azhar, founded as a mosque in Cairo in 970 and developed as an Islamic center of learning over 40 years before Al-Haytham arrived, predated teaching at Oxford by well over a century. The Fatimid state invested in scholars, translators, astronomers, and physicians not out of pure intellectual curiosity, but as instruments of caliphal legitimacy. Libraries were built. Observatories were funded. Stipends were paid to men whose sole obligation was to think. Knowledge production was statecraft. The Fatimids understood that prestige among rival Islamic dynasties was measured partly in scholarship, and they built the institutions to win that competition. What moved through those institutions was not limited to original research. The translation pipeline that passed through Fatimid Cairo determined what the rest of the world would eventually be allowed to know. Greek and Persian texts were translated into Arabic. Decades or centuries later, some of those Arabic texts were translated into Latin and carried to European monasteries and universities, but the pipeline was not neutral. Choices were made about which texts were worth translating, which ideas were worth preserving, which manuscripts were copied, and which were left to rot. What Europe eventually received as the classical inheritance had already been filtered, curated, and in many cases fundamentally rewritten by Arabic-speaking scholars who understood the source material well enough to improve it. What did not enter the pipeline did not enter the European record. The texts that stayed in Arabic, the ideas that were never selected for transmission, represent a silence in the Western intellectual tradition that has never been fully measured. The deepest irony of Al-Haytham's story is its origin. Al-Hakim did not imprison a scientist. He imprisoned a failed engineer. The punishment was meant to neutralize a man who had wasted the caliphate's resources on an impossible dam. Instead, it produced one of the most influential scientific works in human history, a book that would be cited, translated, and studied for the next 700 years. 7 centuries of influence from a single act of political spite. In 1989, Abdulhamid Sabra of Harvard University published a critical translation of the Book of Optics. His analysis demonstrated that Al-Haytham's experimental methodology preceded and directly influenced Roger Bacon and Johannes Kepler. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The comfortable version of this history says that Islamic scholars preserved Greek knowledge and transmitted it to Europe. Preserved, as though the role were custodial. Al-Haytham did not preserve Greek optics. He demolished them. Euclid and Ptolemy were wrong about the fundamental mechanism of sight, and Al-Haytham proved it through experiments that no Greek philosopher had ever attempted. This was not preservation. This was replacement. The scientific method was not a European invention. It was formalized in a room in Cairo by a man who was not allowed to leave. The method that defines modern science was born in captivity, in a civilization the modern world credits only with safekeeping. Number 8. The Chola Dynasty. 80 tons of granite. A single block, placed 216 feet above the ground. The capstone of the Brihadiswarar Temple in Thanjavur, completed in the year 1010, under the reign of Rajaraja Chola I. No crane, no steel cable, no hydraulic lift. The block was quarried from a source approximately 6 kilometers from the temple site, transported across open ground, raised to the height of a 20-story building, and set into position with such precision that it has not shifted in over 1,000 years. No surviving Tamil text describes the method. No engineering diagram has been recovered. The capstone simply sits where it was placed, and no fully satisfying explanation for how it arrived there has ever been produced. The ramp theory, the most commonly proposed solution, requires a continuous earthen ramp beginning several kilometers from the temple to achieve the necessary gradient. The volume of earth required to construct such a ramp would itself constitute one of the largest construction projects in the ancient world, and no archaeological trace of it has been found. Alternative theories involving counterweights, levers, and incremental lifting mechanisms each introduce their own impossibilities at the scale and weight involved. The question is not whether the Chola builders were capable. The capstone is the proof that they were. The question is how, and the answer has not survived the civilization that knew it. The empire that built this temple was not a land power that happened to have a coast. Rajendra Chola, the son of Rajaraja, launched an amphibious invasion across the Bay of Bengal in 1025 that targeted the Srivijaya Empire in what is now Indonesia. This was not a coastal raid. It was a sustained military campaign across open ocean, designed to seize control of the maritime trade choke points in the Strait of Malacca. The Cholas understood that whoever controlled the strait controlled the flow of goods between China and the Indian Ocean. The doctrine of using naval force to dominate commercial choke points would not be formally articulated in European military theory until Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. The Cholas executed it 8 centuries earlier. The goods that moved through Chola-controlled waters touched 3 continents. Chinese silk entered the network from the east. Arabian horses traveled south from the Persian Gulf. Indonesian spices, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper passed through the strait and into Chola ports. Indian textiles, woven in Tamil workshops, moved outward in every direction. At each port, at each transfer point, the Chola state extracted duties that funded the temples, the navy, and the administration of an empire that stretched from the Maldives to the Malay Peninsula. The distance from the Chola capital at Thanjavur to the far edge of their naval influence in Sumatra is approximately 5,000 kilometers of open water. That is roughly the width of the Atlantic Ocean. Chola influence was inscribed in temple architecture, trade agreements, and administrative systems across cultures that shared no linguistic or ethnic connection to Tamil Nadu. Hindu temples in Java and Bali carry Chola-era design elements. Tamil inscriptions appear on stone in Southeast Asian port cities that had never been part of India. The port of Nagapattinam at the height of Chola power was a compression of the known world into a single harbor. The heat rose from the stone quays in visible waves. The air carried salt, tar, sandalwood, and the sharp sweetness of black pepper being loaded into holds. Tamil, Arabic, Malay, and Chinese overlapped in the shouts of dockworkers and merchants, negotiating prices for goods that had already changed hands 3 or 4 times before arriving. The timber hulls creaked under new weight. The sails dried in rows along the waterfront, Ships departed for markets their sailors would never see, carrying cargo bound for hands they would never touch. In 2009, Herman Kulka, of the University of Kiel, published a study of Chola-era Tamil inscriptions found across Southeast Asia. His findings confirmed that Rajendra Chola's naval campaigns were not raids but sustained territorial operations, designed to restructure the entire Indian Ocean trade network. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The Cholas are routinely described as a powerful Indian dynasty, a regional power with a strong navy. The word regional does not survive contact with a 5,000-kilometer operational radius. No European state projected naval power beyond the Mediterranean until the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498. The Cholas controlled more ocean than any European power would manage for another 4 centuries. The capstone sits at 216 feet. The empire stretched across 5,000 kilometers of open water. No surviving text explains how either was achieved. The stones remain. The ships are gone. The knowledge is gone. What survives is the evidence that someone possessed it. Number 7. The Kingdom of Benin. The forest floor in what is now southern Nigeria is dense, humid, and tangled with vegetation that reclaims cleared ground within a single growing season. It is not a place that suggests monumental construction. The soil is laterite, red and calcium poor, and the canopy closes overhead like a ceiling. Nothing about the landscape signals that beneath and between the trees, running for thousands of kilometers in every direction, there are walls. Earthen walls, taller than a person in many stretches, carved through the forest in a network so vast that when its full extent was finally measured, it would be described as the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet. The earthworks of the Benin region, including a massive complex of community boundaries, dikes, and ditches, have been estimated to total thousands of kilometers across hundreds of contiguous settlements. The Great Wall was built by successive imperial dynasties over centuries using conscripted labor and state logistics. The walls of Benin were built by hand, from excavated earth, without draft animals, in a tropical forest. They are the largest earthwork in the world prior to the mechanical age. The labor required to dig, shape, and maintain 16,000 kilometers of earthen ramparts in a climate that erodes exposed soil within months is a logistical achievement that no engineering history has adequately explained. Inside those walls, the craftsmen of the Igun Aranwan Guild were producing bronze castings using the lost wax technique at a metallurgical precision that would stun European experts centuries later. The process required exact temperature control during the pour, precise alloy ratios of copper, zinc, and lead, and a wax model that was destroyed in the act of casting, meaning every piece was a single, unrepeatable original. When the first Benin bronzes reached European hands in 1897, metallurgists examined the alloy compositions and found them difficult to reconcile with the tools and furnaces presumed to have been available in pre-contact West Africa. The question was never whether the bronzes were sophisticated, they self-evidently were. The question was how. How were the temperatures controlled? How were the alloys measured? How was this level of consistency achieved across hundreds of individual castings spanning centuries? The answer is that the guild knew, and the knowledge was transmitted within the guild, and the guild is gone. Access to the craft was not open. The Igun Aranwan was a hereditary guild, and its members were selected by birth, not by aptitude. The Oba, the king, controlled who could commission the bronzes and what they could depict. The castings were not art in the modern decorative sense. They were instruments of royal authority, court records, diplomatic gifts, sacred objects encoding specific ceremonies, specific rulers, specific events. A bronze plaque depicting a military campaign was not a celebration, it was a document. A bronze head of an oba was not a portrait, it was a legal instrument establishing legitimacy. The bronzes were archives cast in metal, because metal survives. They were designed to outlast the people who made them, and they did. In 1702, the Dutch merchant David van Nijendale published an account of his visit to Benin City. He described broad streets, orderly houses, and a palace compound of considerable size and complexity. His description was published in Europe and met with something quieter than disbelief. It was absorbed and then released. A European eyewitness had described a functioning city in West Africa that contradicted every assumption his readers held about the continent. and his readers simply chose not to update their assumptions. The account was available, it was cited occasionally in trade reports, it changed nothing. The silence of a European readership that heard the testimony and chose not to absorb it is as revealing as the testimony itself. The plaques that now sit in the British Museum were not excavated from ruins. They were taken in the punitive expedition of 1897, seized from a functioning palace in a functioning city. Each plaque encodes a specific moment, a specific ceremony, a specific figure in a specific posture, wearing specific regalia. They are not decoration, they are documentation. A civilization recording itself in metal because that was the medium that would survive. The British Museum holds them now. Archaeologist Patrick Darling surveyed the extensive earthwork networks of the Benin and Ishan regions, documenting thousands of kilometers of interconnected linear banks and ditches constructed over centuries. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The standard narrative treats the tragedy of Benin as the 1897 expedition, the looting, the burning, and that was a tragedy. But the deeper tragedy is older. A civilization with walls 4 times the length of the Great Wall of China and metallurgical precision that stunned European experts was filed, for centuries, under the category of primitive. The bronzes were not rediscovered, they were reclassified. They had been in European collections and reports the entire time. The problem was never evidence. It was interpretation. The bronzes are in London. The walls are in the forest. The casting technique died with the guild system that the British dismantled. The objects survive. The knowledge that made them does not. And the civilization that produced both was classified as primitive by the people who took them. Number 6. The Caliphate of Córdoba. In the 10th century, a Saxon nun named Hroswitha of Gandersheim sat in a convent in northern Germany and wrote a description of a city she had never visited but whose reputation had reached her through travelers, merchants, and diplomats. She called it the ornament of the world. She was not describing Rome, she was not describing Constantinople, she was describing Córdoba, a city on the Iberian Peninsula governed by an Islamic caliphate, and she was acknowledging, in her own handwriting, that the most remarkable city on her continent was not Christian. The numbers confirm what Hroswitha sensed from a distance. Córdoba, in the mid-10th century, had a population of approximately 500,000. Paris, at the same time, had fewer than 20,000. London had roughly the same. Córdoba had 70 libraries. It had paved streets. It had street lighting, oil lamps maintained by municipal workers so that residents could walk at night without torches. It had running water fed through aqueducts and distributed through a pipe system. It had 900 public baths. London would not have a public sewer system for another 800 years. The amenities that a modern viewer considers baseline urban infrastructure, lighting, sanitation, running water, public bathing, existed in Córdoba a millennium ago. They existed in no Christian European city. Walking through 10th century Córdoba after dark would have been an experience without parallel anywhere else on the continent. The lamps threw shadows across stone facades, the sound of fountains carried from tiled courtyards behind walls. The air smelled of orange groves and jasmine in the warmer months, of wood smoke and baking bread in the cooler ones. The call to prayer echoed from minarets above rooftops that were clean, maintained, and part of a municipal system that employed thousands of workers to keep the city functioning. The streets were not simply clean by accident, they were cleaned by design, maintained by a bureaucracy that understood sanitation as a civic obligation. Nothing in Northern Europe operated at this level, nothing would for centuries. The Library of Al-Hakam II reportedly contained 400,000 volumes. The number is almost certainly inflated by the standards of modern bibliography, but even conservative estimates place it among the largest collections of written knowledge in the medieval world. More important than the size was the process that filled it. The translation schools of Córdoba employed Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars working alongside one another, converting Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit texts into Arabic and Latin. This was not a marginal academic exercise. It was the infrastructure through which classical knowledge re-entered Europe. The texts that would fuel the European Renaissance did not arrive by accident. They arrived through a pipeline that ran through Córdoba, staffed by translators whose names are largely forgotten, funded by a caliphate that understood knowledge as a political asset. What survives in Spain today is not a memory, it is a physical presence. Arabic loanwords in the Spanish language number in the thousands. The irrigation systems of southern Spain, the acequias, are Arabic engineering still carrying water. The Mezquita in Córdoba, a mosque converted into a cathedral after the Christian reconquest, still stands with its original horseshoe arches intact, rows of red and white stone columns stretching in every direction beneath a ceiling that was designed to feel infinite. The physical evidence of who built the most sophisticated thing on European soil is embedded in the language, the agriculture, and the architecture of the country that eventually expelled the people who built it. What was lost when the Caliphate fractured after 1031 was not a city, it was a system. The libraries dispersed, some were burned, the translation schools closed, the scholars left, and many did not find comparable institutions elsewhere. The polyglot intellectual culture that had operated for over a century, Muslims, Jews, and Christians producing scholarship in the same rooms, was replaced by monoculture. The cost was not measured in buildings, it was measured in centuries. The transmission of classical knowledge to Europe slowed, stuttered, and in some fields stopped entirely for generations. The pipeline went quiet, the translators stopped translating, the books stopped arriving. In 2002, Maria Rosa Menocal of Yale University published a study of convivencia culture in Córdoba. Her research documented the systematic intellectual collaboration between Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars and its role in transmitting classical knowledge to medieval Europe. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Córdoba was not an outlier in the Islamic world. It was an outlier on the European continent. The most advanced city in Europe, by every measurable standard, was not part of what Europe calls its own civilization. The standard narrative of European progress runs from Rome through the Dark Ages to the Renaissance as though it were a single, continuous thread. But that thread has a hole in the middle that is 500,000 people wide, and it is speaking Arabic. The horseshoe arches are still standing. The irrigation channels still carry water. The loanwords are in every Spanish sentence. Europe's own history contains a chapter it did not write, in a language it does not credit, built by people it prefers to remember as invaders rather than architects. Number 5. The Vijayanagara Empire. Around the year 1520, a Portuguese horse trader named Domingo Paes traveled inland from the western coast of India and arrived at a city he had not expected to find. He had seen Lisbon, he had seen Goa, he had traded in ports across the Indian Ocean. Nothing had prepared him for what he walked into. The city of Vijayanagara, he wrote, was as large as Rome. The markets stretched beyond sight. The temples were covered in carved figures so densely packed that the stone beneath them disappeared. The irrigated gardens extended past the city walls into the surrounding hills. The processions of the king involved elephants draped in gold plate, dancers in jeweled costumes, and soldiers in numbers that Paes struggled to estimate. He was a man who had traveled widely and was not easily impressed. His account reads like someone trying to convince a future reader that what he saw was real. The city's population at its peak is estimated at several 100,000, comparable to contemporary Paris. The markets operated on a scale that Paes compared to the largest European trade fairs, but permanent rather than seasonal. Gemstones, textiles, spices, horses, and metalwork moved through a commercial infrastructure that connected Vijayanagara to trade networks reaching China, Southeast Asia, Persia, and East Africa. The temples were not merely religious buildings. They were economic engines, employing thousands of workers, managing agricultural land, and functioning as banks that lent capital to merchants. The city was not a court surrounded by huts. It was a metropolitan system with hydraulic infrastructure, planned roads, and a defensive perimeter that enclosed an area of over 650 square kilometers. Paes recorded all of it. He wrote it down in a document that would survive the thing he was describing by less than 50 years. The Battle of Talikota, in 1565, ended Vijayanagara in a way that battles do not normally end cities. A coalition of the Deccan sultanates defeated the Vijayanagara army on the field, and what followed was not occupation, it was erasure. The victorious armies entered the city and spent 5 months dismantling it. Not looting it, dismantling it. Temples were defaced stone by stone. Irrigation channels were broken. Aqueducts were destroyed. The systematic nature of the destruction suggests that the objective was not wealth, it was elimination. A city the size of Paris, reduced to rubble in less time than a single growing season. The population scattered. The artisans fled with nothing. The merchants abandoned their inventories. Within a generation, the jungle had begun to grow over the foundations. The markets went quiet, the temples stopped receiving offerings, the irrigation channels stopped carrying water. The streets that Pays had described as bustling with trade and ceremony emptied and stayed empty. Permanently. No one rebuilt, no successor state occupied the site. The ruins at Hampi, which is what the location is called today, are what remains. Carved pillars standing in open fields, temple platforms with no roofs, stone channels that carried water for 4 centuries and now carry nothing. The artisans who carved the temple figures, the dancers who performed in the ceremonial halls, the merchants who ran the gem trade, the laborers who maintained the irrigation system, all of them vanished into the countryside. What they carried with them is unknown. What they left behind is visible from satellite imagery. A city-shaped scar in the landscape, surrounded by jungle that has spent 4.5 centuries reclaiming it. The question of whether the destruction was military strategy or something more deliberate has never been fully resolved. The Deccan sultanates had no interest in occupying Vijayanagara. They did not install a governor, they did not collect tribute from a surviving population, they dismantled the infrastructure that made the city function, and then left. The 5 months of systematic destruction suggest that the goal was not to conquer, but to ensure that the city could never function again. The line between conquest and obliteration is not always visible from the outside. In this case, the victors drew it clearly. In 1900, Robert Sewell published A Forgotten Empire, a compilation of Portuguese and Persian accounts of Vijayanagara. His reconstruction of the city's pre-destruction state remains the primary source, documenting a metropolitan scale that no subsequent survey of the ruins has been able to fully reconcile with the completeness of the destruction that followed. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. Cities fall in war. That is not unusual. They are sacked, looted, and occupied by the victors. They are not taken apart over 5 months, channel by channel, temple by temple, and then abandoned. Vijayanagara was not conquered. It was deleted. The destruction was not a byproduct of victory. It was the objective. Pays wrote it all down. The gardens, the processions, the scale. He recorded a civilization that would cease to exist within 50 years of his visit. His account survives. The city does not. The ruins at Hampi are what is left when a civilization is not defeated but unmade. Number 4. The Mali Empire. The gold markets of Cairo in the early 14th century operated on rhythms that had not changed in generations. Merchants weighed coins on handheld scales. Brokers adjusted prices based on supply from the mines of Nubia and the caravans arriving from the east. The systems were stable, predictable, and self-correcting. Gold moved through Cairo the way water moves through a canal, at a rate determined by the width of the channel and the pressure behind it. Then, in 1324, something arrived from the south that broke the channel entirely. Mansa Musa, the ruler of the Mali Empire, passed through Cairo on his Hajj to Mecca. The caravan reportedly included 60,000 people. Accounts vary on the precise quantity of gold carried, but the most conservative estimates describe several tons distributed across thousands of porters, each carrying 4 pounds. Musa gave gold away. He gave it to officials, to merchants, to beggars, to anyone who approached the procession. He gave so much gold in Cairo that he depressed the local gold price for over a decade. A single individual from sub-Saharan Africa destabilized the economy of the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Not through conquest, not through trade manipulation, through generosity so extreme that the market could not absorb it. The medieval equivalent of a currency crisis, triggered by a man giving gifts on his way to pray. The Hajj was not a pilgrimage in the quiet, devotional sense. It was a diplomatic statement conducted at a volume designed to be heard across the Islamic world. The scale of the entourage, the deliberate display of wealth, the gold distributed at every stop, All of it was a performance of civilizational legitimacy. Musa was not merely fulfilling a religious obligation. He was announcing that the empire behind him was real, that it was rich beyond easy comprehension, and that the Islamic world needed to revise its understanding of who mattered. The 12,000 slaves reportedly carrying gold were not incidental to the message. They were the message. Mali was not asking for recognition. It was making recognition unavoidable. European cartographers tried to process what Musa's Hajj revealed and failed. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, produced on the island of Majorca, depicts Musa seated on a throne holding a gold nugget. They drew the king. They could not draw his kingdom. The underlying geography of West Africa, on that same atlas, is almost entirely fictional. Rivers flow in wrong directions. Cities are placed hundreds of miles from their actual locations. The cartographic silence around Mali is not a gap in knowledge. It is the absence of an entire civilization from the European imagination. They had heard of its ruler, they had felt the economic impact of his journey, and they still could not locate his country on a map. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are the material record of what Mali knew. Hundreds of thousands of texts on astronomy, medicine, jurisprudence, mathematics, and theology, produced and collected over centuries, housed in private libraries and university collections. The texts were transmitted through Islamic scholarly networks that connected Timbuktu to Cairo, Fez, and Damascus. Access was governed by the same systems that governed Islamic scholarship elsewhere: chains of transmission, teacher-student authorization, institutional prestige. But the manuscripts were not preserved in the way that European archives preserve documents. Many remained in private family collections. Many were never catalogued. Many were never translated from the original Arabic or Ajami scripts. And in 2013, during the Islamist occupation of northern Mali, an unknown number were destroyed. The routes that carried Mali's gold to the Mediterranean were among the most physically demanding trade corridors in the ancient world. The trans-Saharan crossing required weeks of travel through open desert. Caravans moved at the pace of their slowest camel. Water sources were memorized, not mapped. A missed well-meant death. The gold was mined in the forests of Bambouk and Bore by laborers whose names do not survive. The salt that traveled south in exchange was cut from deposits at Tagaza, a settlement so remote and hostile that the miners who worked there lived entirely on imported food. The logistics of moving wealth across one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, sustained not for a single journey but for centuries, required an organizational infrastructure that has never been fully reconstructed. In 1973, Nehemiah Levtzion of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published a study of the Mali Empire's economic infrastructure. His research demonstrated that the trans-Saharan gold trade constituted the largest single source of bullion entering the Mediterranean economy between the 11th and 15th centuries. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The manuscripts of Timbuktu are not museum pieces safely preserved under glass. Many have never been translated. Many remain in crumbling private collections in families that have guarded them for generations, without the resources to conserve them. Many were burned in 2013. The knowledge inside them is not preserved. It is dying. Not in the 14th century, in the 21st. The gold is spent. The trade routes are sand. The manuscripts are burning. The question of what Mali knew is not a historical question. It is an emergency. Number 3. The Khmer Empire. In 2012, a team of Australian and Cambodian archaeologists mounted a LiDAR scanner beneath a helicopter and flew it over the jungle canopy north of Siem Reap, Cambodia. LiDAR works by firing millions of laser pulses at the ground and measuring the time each pulse takes to return. The technology penetrates vegetation. It sees through the canopy to the earth beneath. The team expected to find some evidence of settlement around the known temple complexes. What the data revealed when it was processed was something that forced the rewriting of virtually everything previously understood about the site. Beneath the trees, invisible from the ground, was a city. Not a temple complex, not a ceremonial center. A city. An urban grid covering an area larger than modern Los Angeles. Streets, neighborhoods, residential blocks, water channels, agricultural infrastructure, all laid out in a pattern that was unmistakably planned and unmistakably enormous. The Greater Angkor urban footprint extended over approximately 1,000 square kilometers. Medieval London covered roughly 3. Angkor was more than 300 times the size. The city had been there for 600 years, hidden by the canopy, unseen by every archaeologist who had walked the ground beneath it. The infrastructure that made a city of that scale possible was hydraulic. Barrages, massive rectangular reservoirs, captured monsoon rainfall. Canals distributed the water through the dry season to rice paddies, residential areas, and the temple complexes that are the only part of Angkor most people have seen in photographs. The system was not decorative, it was existential. Without controlled water, the population could not eat. Without the barrages, the dry season would have emptied the city within a generation. The engineering problem is staggering. A hydraulic network managing water across 1,000 square kilometers requires precise elevation mapping, controlled gradients, and an understanding of seasonal flow patterns that modern engineers model with computers. The Khmer did it without surveying instruments, without computational tools, and without the luxury of trial runs. A miscalculated gradient in a canal serving 10,000 people does not produce a minor inconvenience. It produces a famine. Every element had to work. The evidence suggests that for centuries, it did. The reason the scale was invisible for so long is itself a kind of impossibility. French colonial archaeologists arrived at Angkor in the 19th century and focused on the temples. The sandstone towers of Angkor Wat, the carved faces of the Bayon, the strangler figs consuming Ta Prohm. These were visible, photogenic, and legible within a European framework that equated monumental stone architecture with civilization. Everything between the temples was classified as jungle, empty space. The assumption was that the temples were the city, and the forest around them was wilderness. LiDAR demolished that assumption in a single flight. The forest was the city. The temples were the monuments. The archaeologists had been standing inside the settlement for over a century without recognizing it, because their framework could only see stone. What it meant to live inside a hydraulic civilization was not a question of engineering admiration. It was a question of daily survival. The barrages required constant maintenance. Silt had to be cleared. Channels had to be regraded. Embankments had to be reinforced before every monsoon season. The labor was not seasonal. It was permanent. And the consequences of failure were not theoretical. When the water system eventually deteriorated, likely accelerated by a series of severe droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries, the fields dried. The canals silted. The barrages lost capacity. The population that had depended on controlled water for centuries found itself in a landscape that could no longer support it. The city did not fall to an army. It fell to thirst. The markets did not close because of invasion. They closed because the water stopped. The silence that settled over Angkor was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a system that had sustained 1 million lives, quietly ceasing to function. Angkor at its peak, in the early 12th century, would have been a landscape of sound and motion that no person standing on the ground could have fully perceived. Water moved through channels on every side. The light off the barrages at dawn turned the reservoirs into mirrors stretching to the horizon. The density of human activity, farming, building, trading, worshipping, was spread across a grid so vast that it could only be comprehended from the air, and no one could see it from the air. The people who lived inside Angkor never knew what it looked like. No one did, until 2012. In 2016, Damien Evans of the École Française d'Extrême Orient published an expanded LiDAR survey. His findings confirmed that the Greater Angkor landscape was the largest pre-industrial settlement complex ever identified, with hydraulic infrastructure unmatched anywhere in the medieval world. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The first impossibility is scale. Angkor was not a temple complex. It was the largest city on Earth, and it hid under the canopy for 600 years. The audience absorbs this. Then the second impossibility arrives. The hydraulic system that sustained it was more sophisticated than anything Europe would build for another 500 years. The city was not merely large. It was engineered at a level that the viewer's own civilization did not reach until the industrial era. The temples are what survived because they were made of stone. The city was made of wood and water and human maintenance. When the maintenance stopped, the wood rotted, the water drained, and the jungle returned. What remains is the skeleton. The living city is gone. The technology that made it breathe is gone. LiDAR showed us the bones. It cannot show us the pulse. Number 2. Song Dynasty China. Movable type printing, 400 years before Gutenberg. Gunpowder weapons, 300 years before European cannons. Magnetic compass navigation, a century before European sailors adopted it. Paper currency, 600 years before the Bank of England issued its first note. Blast furnaces using coke as fuel, 700 years before the process appeared in England. Canal lock systems, mechanical clocks, watertight ship compartments. Each one of these innovations, taken individually, would be a significant entry in any history of technology. All of them emerged from a single dynasty in a single country within a span of roughly 3 centuries. The Song dynasty ruled China from 960 to 1279. During that window, the technological foundation of the modern world was laid. The audience has already interacted with Song dynasty technology today. The paper currency in a wallet, or the digital payment that replaced it, descends from Song-era jiaozi, the first government-issued paper money in human history. The compass algorithm in a phone traces its lineage to Song-era magnetized needles floated on water. The book on a shelf exists because of movable type. The fireworks at the last public celebration were gunpowder. Every one of these objects is a Song dynasty product, carried forward through centuries of transmission, adoption, and refinement, with the original source progressively erased from the attribution. The modern world is not built on European invention. It is built on Song dynasty invention, repackaged. Kaifeng, the Song capital, had a population of over 1 million residents in the 11th century. London at the same time had fewer than 20,000. 50 Londons could fit inside one Kaifeng. The gap was not a difference of degree, it was a difference of category. Kaifeng had restaurants with specialized menus. It had tea houses. It had entertainment districts that operated after dark. It had a literate merchant class that purchased printed books from street vendors. It had a night market culture that would be immediately recognizable to anyone living in a modern Asian city. A European traveler arriving in Kaifeng in the 11th century would have experienced something closer to time travel than culture shock. The city operated on principles that Europe would not adopt for another 700 years. Gunpowder's transition from spectacle to weapon was not accidental. The Song state faced existential military pressure from the Jurchen Jin dynasty to the north, and, later, from the Mongol Empire. The court funded systematic research into military applications of gunpowder. Fireworks became fire arrows. Fire arrows became fire lances. Fire lances became bombs packed with shrapnel. Rockets were developed for naval warfare. Flamethrowers that projected streams of burning liquid were mounted on city walls. The Song military-industrial complex, and that is not an anachronistic term, produced the first guns, the first bombs, and the first rockets in human history, all in response to a strategic threat that the court understood it could not survive through conventional means alone. Innovation was not a cultural value, it was a survival mechanism. The paradox is absolute. The most technologically advanced civilization on Earth fell to cavalry armies operating with simpler tools. The Mongols did not defeat the Song with superior technology. They defeated them with superior mobility, superior logistics, and a willingness to absorb casualties that the Song could not match. Gunpowder, compass navigation, printed communication, mechanical engineering, none of it was sufficient to prevent the conquest. The technologies survived because the Mongols adopted them. The state that invented them did not survive. The Song court retreated south, held on for another generation, and collapsed in 1279, when the last emperor drowned at the naval battle of Yamen. The innovations continued to propagate westward along trade routes, eventually reaching Europe, where they would be reinvented, renamed, and credited to European genius centuries later. The question that haunts the history of technology was first articulated by Joseph Needham of the University of Cambridge, beginning in 1954. His multi-volume Science and Civilization in China documented over 1,000 years of Chinese technological primacy and posed the question that still bears his name. If the Song dynasty possessed every component required for an industrial revolution, movable type, blast furnaces, mechanical power, paper currency, compass navigation, gunpowder weapons. Why did the Industrial Revolution not happen in China first? The Needham question has never been conclusively answered. What is clear is that the trajectory was present, the components were assembled, the momentum was building, and then the Mongols arrived. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The comfortable version of this history says China invented some things early. Gunpowder, paper, the compass. These are acknowledged in textbooks as Chinese contributions to global progress. Contributions. As though the song were one voice in a choir. The song did not contribute to global progress. They were global progress. Every foundational technology of the modern world was developed within a single dynasty. That is the first impossibility, and the audience absorbs it. Then the second impossibility arrives. They had everything needed for an industrial revolution, centuries before it occurred in Europe, and it was terminated by external conquest. What happened in 18th century Britain was not the birth of the modern world. It was a second attempt. The first was already underway. Progress is not a line. It is not inevitable. It can be unmade. The Industrial Revolution was not a beginning. It was a repetition. And no one told them. There is a pattern running through every item on this list. 10 civilizations, spanning 4 continents and 1,000 years, each operating at a level that the standard narrative of history does not account for. The evidence is not ambiguous. The stelae are standing. The bronzes are in museums. The manuscripts exist. The LiDAR data is published. The inventions are in daily use. What is ambiguous is why the story most of the world was taught does not include them. The simplest explanation is that the story was never designed to include them. It was designed to explain how one civilization arrived at modernity and why that arrival was inevitable. Every item on this list is evidence that it was not. The question is not whether these empires existed. They did. The question is what kind of history leaves them out, and who that history was written for. That question does not belong to the past. It belongs to the present. Number 1. Great Zimbabwe. The landscape of southeastern Zimbabwe is dry scrubland, scattered trees, and red earth baked hard under a sun that does not relent for most of the year. It is the kind of terrain a traveler passes through without stopping. There is nothing about the ground that suggests anything has ever been built here. Then the walls appear. Granite blocks, precisely cut, fitted without mortar, rising 36 feet from the ground and 16 feet thick at the base. They curve in smooth arcs across the hillside, enclosing spaces that are clearly deliberate, clearly planned, and clearly the work of a civilization that understood stone at a level most of the medieval world did not. The great enclosure's outer wall contains approximately 15,000 tons of granite. Every block was quarried by hand, shaped without metal tools in the early phases of construction, and placed with a precision that leaves no visible gap between the stones. The fitting is so tight that a knife blade cannot be inserted between the blocks in most sections. For comparison, the minor pyramids at Giza required roughly similar volumes of stone, and those are among the most celebrated engineering achievements in human history. Great Zimbabwe achieved comparable precision in a location that European maps of the same period marked as empty. Inside the enclosures, archaeologists have recovered Chinese ceramics from the Ming Dynasty, glass beads traced to the Indian Ocean coast, gold artifacts, and iron tools. The trade network that supplied these objects connected the interior of southern Africa to the Swahili coast, to the Indian Ocean, to China. Great Zimbabwe was not isolated. It was connected to the world. The world simply refused to acknowledge it. When European colonists encountered the ruins in the late 19th century, they could not accept what they saw. The walls were too precise. The enclosures were too large. The engineering was too advanced. The conclusion they drew was not that their assumptions about Africa were wrong. The conclusion was that Africans could not have built it. Alternative theories were manufactured. Phoenicians, ancient Israelites, Arab traders, a lost white civilization, anyone but the Shona people who had lived on the surrounding land for centuries and whose oral histories described the construction of the city. The Rhodesian colonial government made this denial state policy. Archaeologists who presented evidence of African origin were defunded, discredited, or expelled from the country. The site's name was appropriated by the colonial territory itself, which became Rhodesia, a country named after Cecil Rhodes and built on the premise that the civilization whose ruins it contained could not have been African. In 1929, the British archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson conducted a systematic excavation of Great Zimbabwe. Her findings were unambiguous. The construction was Shona, the dating was medieval, the engineering was indigenous. There was no Phoenician influence, no Arab construction, no lost white civilization. The stones were African stones, shaped by African hands, placed by African engineers, in a city that had functioned as the capital of a prosperous trading state for centuries. Her findings were published. They were presented at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. They were met with political hostility so intense that the implications of her work were suppressed for decades. The Rhodesian government continued to promote the myth of foreign construction until 1980, when the country gained independence and renamed itself Zimbabwe, after the site the colonial state had spent a century trying to deny. The silence that surrounded Caton Thompson's findings was not passive. It was engineered. Which archaeologists were permitted to publish was controlled. Which findings reached the public was managed. The colonial state did not merely ignore evidence, it constructed ignorance. The difference between those two actions is the difference between negligence and policy. The evidence was physical, visible, measurable. The granite blocks do not lie. But the interpretive framework that European archaeology brought to Great Zimbabwe was not designed to see an African-built stone city. It was designed to explain why such a thing was impossible. The problem was never the stones. The problem was the eyes. The forensic question underneath all of it is why the misattribution survived so long. The answer is not complexity. It is simplicity. The assumption that sub-Saharan Africa could not have produced monumental architecture was not a conclusion drawn from evidence. It was a premise. The evidence was encountered, and when it contradicted the premise, the evidence was reinterpreted rather than the premise being revised. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is a feature of it. The framework determined what could be seen, and for nearly a century, what could be seen at Great Zimbabwe was anything except the truth. Caton Thompson's 1929 excavation confirmed unambiguously that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the modern Shona people. That finding was suppressed by the Rhodesian colonial government for the next 51 years. But here is where the standard explanation falls apart. The comfortable version of this history says the system corrected itself. Caton Thompson published. The truth came out. Science worked, eventually. But the system did not correct itself. Caton Thompson published in 1929. The Rhodesian government continued the suppression until 1980. 51 years after the evidence was in print, the lie was still official policy. The correction did not come from scholarship. It came from a war of independence. The truth about Great Zimbabwe was not discovered. It was liberated. The walls are still standing. The granite has not moved. The evidence has been visible for 1,000 years. The question was never what Great Zimbabwe was. The question was, who was allowed to say so? And the history that most of the world was taught was not incomplete by accident. It was edited. The question is not whether the knowledge was lost, it is whether it was taken. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.